Chapter 25 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 25. Hair Like the Sunshine. Well, grumbled Lawler, settling back comfortably into his chair, one of these days I'm going to clean out my whole gang and put in a new one. They maybe won't be any better, but they can't be any wuss. Nevertheless, he did not seem in the least downhearted, but apparently had some difficulty in restraining his broad grin. The voice of the grim cook returned. I'll see Nellie in the crowd, in the crowd. I'll see Nellie in the crowd, in the crowd. I'll see Nellie in the crowd, and I'll holler to her loud. Hey Nellie, ain't you proud? Damn your eyes. I ask you, cried Lawler, with freshly risen wrath, is that any way to go around talking about women? Not talking, he's singing, answered Bard. Let him alone. The thunder of their burly Ganymede singing rose and echoed about them. And this shall be my Nell, be my Nell, and this shall be my Nell, my Nell, and this shall be my Nell. Sam, I hope you go to hell. Sam, I hope you sizzle well. Damn your eyes. Shorty Kilrain appeared in the doorway, his mouth wide on the last long wailing note. Shorty, said Lawler, with a sort of hopeless sadness, ain't you never been educated to sing no better songs than that? Why, you old gray-headed, began Shorty, and then stopped short and hitched his trousers violently. Lawler pushed the whiskey bottle and the glass toward Bard. Help yourself. And to Kilrain, who was leaving the room, come back here. Well, snarled the sailor, half turning at the door, while I'm running this here ranch, you're going to have manners, see? If manners was like whiskers, said the unabashed Shorty, it'd take me nigh on 30 years to get 'em. And he winked at Bard for sympathy. Lawler smashed his fist on the table. What I say is, are you running this ranch or am I? Well, growled Kilrain, if you was a kid, you'd have your mouth washed out with soap. The eyes of Shorty bulged. It ought to be done now, but there ain't no one I'd give such dirty work to. What you're going to do is stand right here and show us you know how to sing a decent song in a decent way. That there song of yours didn't leave nothing sacred untouched, from parsons and jails to women and the gallows. Stand over there and sing. The sailor's eyes filmed over with cold hate. Was I hired to punch cattle, he said, or make a blasted roaring fool out of myself? You was hired, answered Lawler softly, as he filled his glass to the brim with old rye whiskey, to be a cook, and you're the rottenest hash slinger that ever served cold dough for biscuits. A blasted roaring fool you've already made of yourself by singing that song. I want another one to get the sound of that out of my ears. Tune up. Thoughts of murder, ill-concealed, whitened the face of the sailor. Some day, he began hoarsely, and then stopped, for a vision came to him of blithe mornings when he could sit on top of the corral fence, rolling a cigarette, while some other cowpuncher went into the herd and roped and saddled his horse. Do you mean this, Drew? He asked with an odd emphasis. Do you think I'm talking for fun? What shall I sing? He asked in a voice which was reduced to a faint whisper by rage. I don't know, mused Lawler, but maybe it ought to lie between Alice Ben Bolt and Anna Laurie. What do you choose, partner? He turned to Bard. Alice Ben Bolt, by all means. I don't think he could manage the Scotch. Start, commanded Lawler. The sailor closed his eyes, tilted his head back, twisted his face to a hideous grimace, and then, opening his shapeless mouth, emitted a tremendous wail which took shape in the following words. Oh, don't you remember sweet Alice Ben Bolt, sweet Alice with the hair like sunshine? Shut up, Lawler roared. It required a moment for Shorty to unkink the congested muscles of his face. What the hell's the matter now? He inquired. Who ever heard of hair like sunshine? There ain't no such thing possible. Hair so brown, that's what the song says. Shorty, we got more feelin' for our ears than to let you go on singin' and showin' your ignorance. Go on back to the kitchen. Kilrain drew a long breath, regarded Lawler again with that considerate, expectant eye, and turned on his heel and strode from the room. Back to Bard came fragments of tremendous cursing of an epic breadth and a world-wide inclusiveness. Got to do things like this once in a while to keep 'em under my thumb," Lawler explained genially. With all his might Bard was struggling to reconcile this big-handed vulgarian with his mental picture of the man who could write for an epitaph: "Here sleeps Joan, the wife of William Drew. She chose this place for rest." But the two ideas were not inclusive. He said aloud: "Aren't you afraid that black-eyed fellow will run a knife between your ribs one of these dark nights?" "Who? My ribs?" exclaimed Lawler, nevertheless stirring somewhat uneasily in his chair. "Nope. They know that I'm William Drew. They may be hard, but they know I'm harder." "Oh," drawled the other, and his eyes held with uncomfortable steadiness on the rosy face of Lawler. "I understand." To cover his confusion Lawler seized his glass. "Here's to you, drinkin' deep." He tossed off the mighty potion. Bard had poured only a few drops into his glass. He had too much sympathy for his empty stomach to do more. His host leaned back, coughing, with tears of pleasure in his eyes. "Damn me," he breathed reverently. "I ain't touched stuff like this in 10 years." "Is this new stock?" inquired Bard, apparently puzzled. "This?" said Lawler, recalling his position with a start. "Sure it is. Brand new. Yep, stuff ain't been in here more'n 5 days. Smooth, ain't it? Medicine, that's what I call it. A gentleman's drink, goes down like water." Observing a rather quizzical light in the eyes of Bard, he felt that he had probably been making a few missteps, and being warmed greatly at the heart by the whiskey, he launched forth in a new phase of the conversation. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 26. The Critique of Pure Reason. "Speakin' of hard cattlemen," he said, "I could maybe tell you a few things, son." "No doubt of it," smiled Anthony. "I presume it would take a very hard man to handle this crowd." "Fairly hard," nodded the redoubtable Lawler, "but they ain't nothin' to the men that used to ride the range in the old days." "No?" "Nope. One of them men? Why, he'd eat a dozen like Kildare and think nothing of it. Them was the sort I learned to ride the range with." "I've heard something about a fight which you and John Bard had against the Piotto gang. Care to tell me anything of it?" Lawler lolled easily back in his chair and balanced a second big drink between thumb and forefinger. "There ain't no harm in talk, son. Sure, I'll tell you about it. What do you want to know?" "The way Bard fought. The way you both fought." "Let me see." He closed his eyes like one who strives to recollect. He was, in fact, carefully recalling the skeleton of facts which Drew had told him earlier in the day. 6 months me and Bard had been trailin' Piotto. Damn his old soul. Bard, he'd have quit cold a couple of times, but I kept him at it." "John Bard would have quit?" asked Anthony softly. "Sure. He was a big man, was Bard, but he didn't have none too much endurance." "Go on," asked Anthony. 6 months, I say. We was ridin' day and night, wearin' out a hoss about every week of that time. Then we just got a hint from a bartender that maybe the Piottos was nearby in that section. It didn't need no more than a hint for us to get busy on the trail. We hit a circle through those mountains. It was over near Twin Rivers, where the ground ain't got a level stretch of 100 yards in a whole day's ridin'. Along about evening of the second day we come to the house of Tom Shaw, a squatter. Bard would have passed the house up, because he knew Shaw and said there was nothin' crooked about him. But I didn't trust nobody in them days, and I ain't changed a pile since." "That," remarked Anthony, "is a good example I think I shall follow." "Eh?" said Lawler, somewhat blankly. "Well, we rode up on the blind side of the house. From the north, see? Got off and sneaked around to the east end of the shack. The windows was covered with cloths on the inside, which didn't make me none too sure about Shaw havin' no dealings with crooks. It ain't ordinary for a feller to be savin' on light. Pretty soon we found a tear in one of the cloths, and lookin' through we seen old Piotto sittin' beside Tom Shaw, with his daughter on the other side. We went back to the north side of the house, and figured out different ways of tackling the job. There was only two of us, see, and the fellers inside that house were all cut out for man killers. How would you have gone after 'em, son?" "Opened the door, I suppose, and started shooting," said Bard, "if I had the courage." The other stared. "You heard this story before?" "Not this part." "Well, that was just what we done. First off, it sounds like a fool way of tacklin' them, but when you think twice it was the best of all. They never was expectin' anybody fool enough to walk right into the room and start fightin'. We went back and had a look at the door. It wasn't none too husky. John Bard he tried the latch, soft, but the thing was locked, and when he pulled there was a snap. 'Who's there?' hollers someone inside. We froze agin the side of the house, lookin' at each other pretty sick. 'Nobody's there,' sings out the voice of Piotto. 'We can trust Tom Shaw, just because he knows that if he double crossed us he'd be the first man to die.' And we heard Tom say, sort of quaverin', 'God sakes, boys, what do you think I am?' 'Now,' says Bard, and we both put our shoulders to the door and takes our guns in our hands. We each had two. The door went down like nothin', because we was both husky fellers in them days. And as she smashed in, the fall upset two of the boys sittin' closest and gave 'em no chance on the quick draw. The rest of 'em was too paralyzed at first, except old Piotto. He pulled his gun, but what he shot was Tom Shaw, who just leaned forward in his chair and crumpled dead. We went at 'em pumpin' lead. It wasn't no fight at first, and half of 'em was down before they had their guns workin'. But when the real hell started, it was no fireside story, I'll tell a man. We had the jump on 'em, but they meant business. I dropped to the floor and lay on my side shootin'. Bard he followed suit. They went down like tenpins till our guns were empty. Then we up and rushed what was left of 'em, Piotto and his daughter. Bard makes a pass to knock the gun out of the hand of Joan and wallops her in the head instead. Down she goes. I finished Piotto." "Broke his back, eh?" "Me? Who ever heard of breaking a man's back? Ha ha ha! You been hearin' fairy tales, son. Nope, I choked the old rat." "Were you badly hurt?" Lawler searched his memory hastily. There was no information on this important point. "Couple of grazes," he said, dismissing the subject with a tolerant wave of the hand. "Nothin' worth talkin' about." "I see," Bard nodded. It occurred to Lawler that his guest was taking the narrative in a remarkably philosophic spirit. He reviewed his telling of the story hastily and could find nothing that jarred. He concluded that was the way of livin' in them days. "They ain't no more. They ain't no more." "And now," Anthony said, "the only excitement you get is out of books and running the laborers?" He picked up the book which Lawler had just laid down. "Oh, I read a bit now and then," said the cowpuncher easily, "but I ain't much on book learnin'." Bard was turning the pages slowly. The title, whose meaning dawned slowly on his astonished mind as a sunset comes in winter over a gray landscape, was The Critique of Pure Reason. He turned the book over and over in his hands. It was well thumbed. He asked, controlling his voice, "Are you fond of Kant?" "Eh?" queried the other. "Fond of this book?" "Yep, that's one of my favorites. But I ain't much on any books." "However," said Bard, "the story of this one is interesting." "It is. There's some great stuff in it," mumbled Lawler, trying to squint at the title, which he had quite overlooked during the days in which he first picked it up. Bard laid the book aside and out of sight. "And I like the characters, don't you? Some very close work done with them." "Yep, there's a lot of narrow escapes." "Exactly. I'm glad we agree about books." "So am I. Feller can kill a lot of time chinnin' about books." "Yes, I suppose a good many people have killed time over this book." And as he smiled genially upon the cowpuncher, Bard felt a great relief sweeping over him, a mighty gladness that this was not Drew, that this loose-lipped gabbler was not the man who had written the epitaph over the tomb of Joan Piotto. He lied about the book. He had lied about it all. And knowing that this was not Drew, he suddenly felt as if someone were watching him from behind, someone large and gray and stern of eye, like the giant who had spoken to him so long before in the arena at Madison Square Garden. A game was being played with him, and behind that game must be Drew himself. All Bard could do was wait for developments. The familiar, booming voice of Shorty Kilrain echoed through the house. "Supper!" and a loud clangor of a bell supported the invitation. "Chow time," breathed Lawler heavily, like one relieved at the end of a hard shift of work. "I figure you ain't sorry, son." "No," answered Bard, "but it's too bad to break off this talk. I've learned a lot." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney. Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 27. The Stage. "You first," said Lawler at the door. "I've been taught to let an older man go first," said Bard, smiling pleasantly. "After you, sir." "Any way you want it, Bard," answered Lawler. But as he led the way down the hall he was saying to himself, through his stiffly mumbling lips, "He knows. Calamity was right. There's going to be hell poppin' before long." He lengthened his stride going down the hall to the dining room, and entering, he found the cowpunchers about to take their places around the big table. Straight toward the head to the big chair he stalked, and paused an instant beside little Duffy. Their exchange of whispers was like a muffled rapid fire, for they had finished before young Bard, now just entering the room, could reach them and take his designated seat at the right of Lawler. "He knows," muttered Lawler. "Hell, then it's all up." "No, keep bluffing. Wait. How's everything? Gregory ain't come in, but Drew may put him wise before he gets inside the house." "You done all I could expect," said Lawler as Bard came up. "But tomorrow go back to the same job and try to get something definite." To Bard, "Here's your place, partner. Just been telling Duffy there on your right about some work. Some of the doggies have been rustled lately, and we're on their trail." They took their places, and Bard surveyed the room carefully, as an actor who stands in the wings and surveys the stage on which he is soon to step and play a great part. For Anthony there was a gathering sense of impending disaster and action. What he saw was a long, low apartment, the bare rafters overhead browned by the kitchen smoke, which even now was rolling in from the wide door at the end of the room. The thick, oily smoke of burnt meat, mingled with steam and the nameless vapors of a great oven. There was no semblance of decoration on the walls. The boards were not even painted. It was strictly a place of use, not pleasure. The food itself, which Shorty Kilrain and Calamity Ben now brought on, was distinctly utilitarian rather than appetizing. The piece de resistance was a monstrous platter heaped with beefsteak, not the inviting meat of a restaurant in a civilized city, but thin, brown slabs, fried dry throughout. The real nourishment was in the gravy in which the steak swam. In a dish of even more amazing proportions was a vast heap of potatoes boiled with their jackets on. Lawler commenced loading the stack of plates before him, each with a slab and a potato or two. Meantime, from a number of big coffee pots a stream of liquid, bitter as lie and black as night, was poured into tin cups. Yet the cattlemen at the table settled themselves for the meal with a pleasant expectation, fully equal to that of the most seasoned gourmet in a Manhattan restaurant. The peculiar cowboy's squint, a frowning of the brow and a compression of the thin lips, relaxed. That frown came from the steady effort to shade the eyes from the white-hot sunlight. The compression of the lips was due to a determination to admit none of the air laden with alkali dust, except through the nostrils. It grew in time into a perpetual grimace, so that the expression of an old range rider is that of a man steeling himself to pass through some grim ordeal. Now, as they relaxed, Anthony perceived first of all that most of the grimness passed away from the narrowed eyes, and they lighted instead with good-humored banter, though of a weary nature. One by one they cast off 10 years of age, the lines rubbed out, the jaws which had thrust out grew normal, the leaning heads straightened and went back. They paid not the slightest attention to the newcomer, talking easily among themselves, but Anthony was certain that at least some of them were thinking of him. If they said nothing, their thoughts were the more. In fact, in the meantime little Duffy had passed on to the next man, in a side mutter the significant phrase, He knows. It went from lip to lip like a watchword passing along a line of sentinels. Each man heard it imperturbably, completed the sentence he was speaking before, or maintained his original silence through a pause, then repeated it to his right-hand neighbor. Their demeanor did not alter perceptibly, except that the laughter, perhaps, became a little more uproarious, and they were sitting straighter in their chairs, their eyes brighter. All they knew was that Drew had impressed on them that Bard must not leave that room in command of his six-shooter, or even his hands. He must be bound securely. The working out of the details of execution he had left to their own ingenuity. It might have seemed a little thing to do to greener fellows, but every one of these men was an experienced cowpuncher, and like all old hands on the range they were perfectly familiar with the amount of damage which a single armed man could do. The thing could be done, of course, but the point was to do it with a minimum of danger. So they waited and talked and ate, and always from the corner of their eyes were conscious of the slightly built, inoffensive man who sat beside Lawler near the head of the table. In appearance he was surely most innocuous, but Nash had spoken, and in such matters they were willing to take his word with a childlike faith. So the meal went on, and the only sign, to the most experienced eye, was that the chairs were placed a little far back from the edge of the table, a most necessary condition when men may have to rise rapidly, or get to their holsters for a quick draw. Calamity Ben, bearing a mighty dish of bread pudding, passed directly behind the chair of the stranger. The whole table watched with a sudden keenness, and they saw Bard turn, ever so slightly, just as Calamity passed behind the chair. "I say," he said, "may I have a bit of hot water to put in this coffee?" "Sure," said Calamity, and went on, but the whole table knew that the stranger was on his guard. The mutual suspicion gave a tenseness to the atmosphere, as if it were charged with the electricity of a coming storm, a tingling waiting which made men prone to become silent, and then talk again in fitful outbursts. Or it might be said that it was like a glass full of precipitate, which only waits for the injection of a single unusual substance before it settles to the bottom and leaves the remaining liquid clear. It was for the unusual, then, that the entire assembly waited, feeling momentarily that it must be coming, for the strain could not endure. As for Bard, he stuck by his original apparent indifference, for he still felt sure that the real William Drew was behind this elaborate deception, and the thing for which he waited was some revelation of the hand of the master. The trumps which he felt he held was in being forewarned. He could not see that the others knew his hand. He said to Lawler, "I think a man named Nash works on this ranch. I expected to see him at supper here." "Nash?" answered Lawler. "Sure, he used to be foreman here. Ain't no more. Nope, I couldn't stand for his lip. Didn't mind him gettin' fresh till he tried to ride me. Then I turned him loose." "Where did you meet him?" "While I was riding in this direction." "Want to see him bad?" The other moistened his lips. "Rather. He killed my horse." A silence fell on these who were within hearing. They would not have given equal attention to the story of the killing of a man. "How'd he get away with it?" "The Saverack was between us. Before I could get my gun out he was riding out of range. I'll meet him and have another talk some day." "Well, the range ain't very small." "But, my dear fellow, it's not nearly as big as my certainty of meeting this cur." There was something in the low, slow voice more thrilling than the thunder of actual rage. Those who heard glanced to one another with thoughtful eyes. They were thinking of Nash, and thinking of him with sympathy. Little Duffy, squat and thick set, felt inspiration descend on him. He turned to Bard on his left. "That ain't a full-size .45, is it? That one you're packin'?" "Doesn't it look it?" answered Bard. "Nope, holster seems pretty small to me." "It's the usual gun, I'm sure," said Bard, and pulled the weapon from the leather. Holding the butt loosely, his trigger finger hooked clear around the far side of the guard, he showed the gun. "I was wrong," nodded Duffy, unabashed. "That's the regular kind. Let's have a look at it." And he stretched out his hand. No one would ever have guessed how closely the table followed what now happened, for each man began talking in a voice even louder than before. It was as if they sought to cover the stratagem of Duffy with their noise. "There's nothing unusual about the gun," Bard said, "but I'd be glad to let you have it. except that I've formed a habit of never letting a 6-shooter get away from me. It's a foolish habit, I know, but I can't lose it. If there's any part you'd like to see, just name it." "Thanks," answered Duffy. "I guess I've seen all I want of it." Calamity had failed. Duffy had failed. It began to look as if force of downright numbers must settle the affair. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 28. Sally Breaks a Mirror. As Sally remarked the night before, one does not pay much attention to a toilette when one rises at 5 a.m. At least that is the rule. But Sally, turning with a groan in the chill, dark room, shut off the alarm, lighted the lamp, and set about the serious task of dressing. A woman, after all, is much like a diplomatic statesman. A hint along certain lines is more to her than a sworn statement. She had secured a large mirror, and in front of this she labored patiently for a full 10 minutes, twisting her hair this way and that, and using the comb and brush vigorously. Now and then, as she worked, she became aware that a fluff of hair rolling down low over her forehead did amazing things to her face, and brought her from Sally Fortune into the strange dignity of a lady. But she could not complete any of the maneuvers, no matter how promisingly they started. In the end she dashed a handful of hairpins on the floor, and wound her hair about her head in a few swift turns. She studied the sullen, boyish visage which looked back at her. After all, she would be unmercifully joked if she were to appear with her hair grown suddenly fluffy and womanly. It would become impossible for her to run the eating place without the assistance of a man, and a fighting man at that. So what was the use? She threw the mirror crashing on the floor. It splintered in 1,000 pieces. "After all," she murmured aloud, "do I want to be a woman?" The sullen mouth undoubtedly answered no. The wistful eyes undoubtedly replied in another key. She shrugged the question away and stepped out of her room toward the kitchen, whistling a tune to raise her spirits. "Late, Sally," said the cook, tossing another hot cake on the growing pile which surmounted the warmer. "Sure, I busted my mirror," said Sally. The cook stared at her in such astonishment that he allowed a quantity of dough to fall from the dish cupped in the hollow of his arm. It overflowed the griddle iron. "Blockhead," Sally shouted, "watch your step." She resumed when the dough had been rescued by somewhat questionable means. "Do you think a girl can dress in the dark?" The cook had had too much experience with his employer to press what seemed a tender point. He confined his attention to the pancakes. "There ain't no fool worse than a he fool," continued Sally bitterly. "Which maybe you think a girl can dress without a mirror?" Since this taunt brought no response from her victim, she went into the eating room. It was already filling, and the duties of her strenuous day began. They continued without interruption hour after hour, for the popularity of her restaurant had driven all competition out of Eldara, a result which filled the pocketbook and fattened the bank account of Sally Fortune, but loaded unnumbered burdens onto her strong shoulders. For she could not hire a waiter to take her place. Every man who came into the eating room expected to be served by the slim hands of Sally herself. And he expected also some trifling repartee which would make him pay his bill with a grin. The repartee dragged with Sally today, almost to sullenness. And when she began to grow weary in the early afternoon, there was no reserve of strength on which she could fall back. Suddenly she became aware that she wanted support, aid, comfort. Finally she spilled a great armful of empties down on the long drain board of the sink, turned to the wall, and buried her face in her hands. The cook, Bert, though he cast a startled glance at her, would not have dared to speak after that encounter of the morning, but a rather explosive sniff was too eloquent an appeal to his manliness. His left sleeve had fallen. He rolled it back, tied the strings of the apron tighter about his plump middle, and advanced to the battle. His hand touched the shoulder of the girl. "Sally!" "Shut your face!" moaned a stifled voice. But he took his courage between his teeth and persisted. "Sally, is something wrong?" "Nothing you can right, Fatty," said the same woe-stricken voice. "Sally, if somebody's been gettin' fresh with you." Her arms jerked down. She whirled and faced him with clenched fists, her eyes shining more brightly for the mist which was in them. "Fresh? With me? Why, you poor, one-horned yearling, do you think there's anybody in Eldara man enough to get fresh with me?" Bert retreated a step. Caution was now a moving element in his nature. From a vantage point behind a table, however, he ventured: "Then what is wrong?" Her woe, apparently, was greater than her wrath. She said sadly: "I dunno, Bert. I ain't the man I used to be. I mean the woman." He waited, his small eyes gentle. What woman can altogether resist sympathy, even from a fat man and a cook? Not even the redoubtable soul of Sally. She confessed: "I feel sort of hollow and gone. Around the stomach, Fatty." "Eat," suggested the cook. "I just took a pie out that would—" "But it ain't the stomach. It's like bein' hungry and wantin' no food. Fatty, do you think I'm sick?" "You look kind of whitish." "Fatty, I feel—" She hesitated, as though too great a confession were at her lips. But she stumbled on: "I feel as if I was afraid of something or someone." "That," Bert said confidently, "ain't possible. It's the stomach, Sally. Something ain't agreed with you." She turned from him with a vague gesture of despair. "If this here feelin' is goin' to keep up, why, I wisht I was dead. I wisht I was dead." She went on to the swinging door, paused there to dab her eyes swiftly, started to whistle a tune, and in this fashion marched back to the eating room. Fatty, turning back to the stove, shook his head. He was more than ever convinced in his secret theory that all women are crazy. Sally found that a new man had entered, one whom she could not remember having seen before. She went to him at once, for it seemed to her that she would die, indeed, if she had to look much longer on the familiar, unshaven faces of the other men in the room. "Anything you got?" the stranger said, who was broad of hands and thick of neck, and cast an anxious eye on her. "I hear you seen something of a thinnish, dark feller named Bard." "What do you want with him?" asked Sally with dangerous calm. "I was aimin' to meet up with him, that's all. Partner, if you want to stand in solid around here, don't let out that you're a friend of his. He ain't none too popular. That's the straight and puttin' it nice and easy." "Which who said I was his friend?" said the other with heat. She turned away to the kitchen and reappeared shortly, bearing his meal. The frown with which she departed had disappeared, and she was smiling as brightly as ever while she arranged the dishes in front of him. He paid no attention to the food. "Now," she said, resting both hands on the table and leaning so that she could look him directly in the eye, "what's Bard done now? Horse? Gunfighter? Woman? Which?" The other loosened the bandana that circled his bull neck. "Woman," he said hoarsely, and the blood swelled in his throat and face with veins of purple. "Ah," drawled the girl, and straightening, she dropped both hands on her hips. It was a struggle, but she managed to summon another smile. "Wife? Sister? Sweetheart?" The man stared dubiously on her, and Sally, mother of 500 wild rangers, knew the symptoms of a man eager for a confidant. She slipped into the opposite chair. "It might be any of the three," she went on gently, "and I know because I've seen him work." "Damn his soul!" growled the other by way of a prefix to his story. "It ain't any of the three with me. This Bard, maybe he tried his hand with you." Whether it was rage or scorn that made her start and redden he could not tell. "Me?" she repeated. "A tenderfoot get fresh with me? Stranger, you ain't been long in Eldara, or you wouldn't pull a bonehead like that. 'Scuse me, I was hopin' that maybe you took a fall out of him, that's all." He studied the blue eyes. They had been tinted with ugly green a moment before, but now they were clear, deep, dark, guileless blue. He could not resist. The very nearness of the woman was like a gentle, cool hand caressing his forehead and rubbing away the troubles. "It was like this," he began. "Me and Lizzie had been thick for a couple of years and was just waitin' till I'd corralled enough cash for a start. Then the other day along comes this feller Bard with a queer way of talkin' school language. Made you feel like you was readin' a bit out of a dictionary just to listen to him for a minute. Liz, she never heard nothin' like it, I figure. She got all eyes and sat still and listened. Bein' like that, he plumb made a fool out of Liz, kidded her along, and wound up kissin' her good bye. I didn't see none of this. I just heard about it later. When I come up and started talkin' just friendly with Liz, she got sore and passed me a frosty stare. I didn't think she could be doin' more than kiddin' me a bit, so I kept right on and ended up with Liz sayin' all was over between us. He paused on his tragedy, set his teeth over a sigh, and went on. The feller ain't no good. I know that from a chap that come to the house a few hours after Bard left. Nash was his name. What? Nash. Feller built husky around the shoulders. Looks like a fighter. Know him? Pretty well. Do you say he came to your house right after Bard left it? Yep. Why? How long ago was this? About 3 days. 3 days? What's wrong? Nothin'. You look like you was goin' to murder someone, lady. Her laughter ended with a jerk and jar. Maybe I am. Go on. Tell me more about what this Nash said. Why, he didn't say much. Hinted around that maybe Bard had walked off with the piebald hoss he was ridin'. That's a lie. Lady, said the other a little coldly, you say that like you was a friend of Bard's. Me? There ain't nobody in these parts man enough to say to my face that I'm a friend of that tenderfoot. I'm glad of that. My name's Ralph Boardman. I'm Sally Fortune. Sure, I've heard of you, a lot. Say, you couldn't tip me off where I could hit the trail of Bard. Dunno. Wait, let me see. She studied with closed eyes. What she was thinking was that if Nash had been so close to Bard 3 days before, he was surely on the trail of the tenderfoot, and certainly that meeting in her place had not been a casual one. She set her teeth, thinking of the promise Nash had given to her. Undoubtedly he had laughed at it afterward. And now Bard probably lay stretched out on his back somewhere among the silent hills, looking up to the pitiless brightness of the sky with eyes which could never shut. The hollow feeling of which Sally had complained to Bert grew to a positive ache, and the tears stood up closer to her eyes. Wait around town, she said in a changed voice. I think I heard him say something of riding out. But he'll be back before long. That's the only tip I can give you, partner. She rose and hurried back to the kitchen. Bert, she said, I'm off for the rest of the day. You got to handle the place. He panted. But the heavy rush. It hasn't started yet. It's started for me. What do you mean? Nothing. I'm on my way. So long, Bert. Back in the morning bright and early. If she could not find Bard, at least she could find Nash at the ranch of Drew. And in that direction she headed her racing horse. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 29. The Show. Jansen, the big Swede, was the first to finish his meal in Drew's dining room. For that matter, he was always first. He ate with astonishing expedition, lowering his head until that tremendous, shapeless mouth was close to the plate, and then working knife and fork alternately with an unfaltering industry. Tonight, spurred on by a desire to pass through this mechanical effort and be prepared for the coming action, his speed was something truly marvelous. He did not appear to eat. The food simply vanished from his plate. It was absorbed like a mist before the wind. While the others were barely growing settled in their places, Jansen was already through. He wiped his mouth on the back of his hand, produced Durham and papers, and proceeded to light up. Lawler, struggling still to reestablish himself in the eyes of Bard as the real William Drew, seized the opportunity to exert a show of authority. He smashed his big fist on the table. "Jansen!" he roared. "Eh?" grunted the Swede. "Where was you raised?" "Me? You, squarehead." "Elver Hymanstead Are you sneezin' or talkin' English?" Jansen, irritated, bellowed, Elverheimerstedhaven. That's where I was born." "That's where you was born? Elver damn such a language! No wonder you Swedes don't know nothin'. It takes all your time learnin' how to talk your lingo. But if you ain't never had no special trainin' in manners, I'm going to make a late start with you now. Put out that cigarette." The pale eyes of Jansen stared, fascinated, the vast mouth fell agape. "Maybe," he began, and then finished weakly, "I be damned. There ain't no reasonable way of doubtin' that unless you put out that smoke. Hear me?" Shorty Kilrain, coming from the kitchen, grinned broadly. Having felt the lash of discipline himself, he was glad to see it fall in another place. He continued his gleeful course around that side of the table. And big Jansen slowly, imperturbably, raised the cigarette and inhaled a mighty cloud of smoke which issued at once in a rushing, fine blue mist, impelled by a snort. "Maybe," he rumbled, completing his thought, "maybe you're one damn fool." "I'm going to learn you who's boss in these parts," boomed Lawler. "Put out that cigarette. Don't you know no better than to smoke at the table?" Jansen pushed his chair back and started to rise. There was no doubt as to his intentions. They were advertised in the dull and growing red which flamed in his face. But Kilrain, as though he had known such a moment would come, caught the Swede by the shoulders and forced him back into the chair. As he did so, he whispered something in the ear of Jansen. "Let him go," bellowed Lawler. "Let him come. Don't hold him. I ain't had work for my hands for 5 years. I need exercise. I do." The mouth of Jansen stirred, but no words came. A hopeless yearning was in his eyes. But he dropped the cigarette and ground it under his heel. "I thought," growled Lawler, "that you knew your master, but don't make no mistake again. Speakin' personal, I don't think no more of knockin' down a Swede than I do of flickin' ashes offen a cigar." He indulged in a side glance at Bard to see if the latter were properly impressed, but Anthony was staring blankly straight before him, unable, to all appearances, to see anything of what was happening. "Kilrain," went on Lawler, "trot out some cigars. You know where they're kept." Kilrain, falling to the temptation, asked, "Where's the key to the cabinet?" For Drew kept his tobacco in a small cabinet, locked because of long experience with tobacco-loving employees. Lawler started to speak, checked himself, fumbled through his pockets, and then roared, "Smash the door open. I misplaced the key." No semblance of a smile altered the faces of the cowpunchers around the table, but glances of vague meaning were interchanged. Kilrain reappeared almost at once, bearing a large box of cigars under each arm. "The eat's bein' over," announced Lawler. "We can now light up. Open them boxes, Shorty. Am I goin' to work on you the rest of my life teachin' you how to serve cigars?" Kilrain sighed deeply, but obeyed, presenting the open boxes in turn to Bard, who thanked him, and to Lawler, who bit off the end of his smoke, continued, "A match, Kilrain." And he waited, swelling with pleasure, his eyes fixed upon space. Kilrain lighted a match and held it for the two in turn. 2 rows of waiting, expectant eyes were turned from the whole length of the table toward the cigars. "Shall I pass on the cigars?" suggested Bard. "These smokes?" breathed Lawler. "Waste 'em on common hands? Partner, you ain't serious, are you?" A breath like the faint sighing of wind reached them. The cowpunchers were resigned and started to roll their own Durham. But it seemed as if a chuckle came from above. It was only some sound in the gasoline lamp, a big fixture which hung suspended by a slender chain from the center of the ceiling and immediately above the table. "Civilizin' cowpunchers," went on Lawler, tilting back in his chair and bracing his feet against the edge of the table. "Civilizin' cowpunchers is worse'n breakin' mustangs. They's some that say it can't be done. But look at this crew. Do they look like ruffians?" A stir had passed among the cowpunchers, and solemn stares of hate transfixed Lawler, but he went on, "I'm askin' you, do these look rough?" "I should say," answered Bard courteously, "that you have a pretty experienced lot of cattlemen." "Experienced? Well, they'll pass. They've had experience with bar whiskey and talkin' to their cards at poker, but aside from bein' pretty much drunks and crookin' the cards, they ain't anything uncommon. But when I got 'em they was wild, they was. Why, if I talked like this in front of 'em they'd have been guns pulled. But look at 'em now. I ask you, look at 'em now. Ain't they tame? They heard me call 'em what they are, but they don't even bat an eye. Yes, sir, I've tamed 'em. They took a lot of licking, but now they're tame. Hello!" For through the door stalked a newcomer. He paused and cast a curious eye up the table to Lawler. "What the hell?" he remarked naively. "Where's the chief?" "Fired!" bellowed Lawler, without a moment of hesitation. "Who fired him?" asked the new man, with an expectant smile, like one who waits for the point of a joke, but he caught a series of strange signals from men at the table and made a broad wink. "I fired him, Gregory," answered Lawler. "I fired Nash." He turned to Bard. "You see," he said rather weakly, "the boys is used to callin' Nash the chief." "Ah, yes," said Bard, "I understand." And Lawler felt that he did understand, and too well. Gregory, in the meantime, silenced by the mysterious signs from his fellow cowpunchers, took his place and began eating without another word. No one spoke to him, but as if he caught the tenseness of the situation, his eyes finally turned and glanced up the table at Bard. It was easy for Anthony to understand that glance. It was the sort of look which the curious turn on the accused man of a great crime, and sitting in the courtroom guilty. His trial in silence had continued until he was found guilty. Apparently, he was now to be both judged and executed at the same time. There could not be long delay. The entrance of Gregory had almost been the precipitant of action, and though it had been smoothed over to an extent, still the air was each moment charged with suspense. The men were lighting their second cigarettes. With each second it grew clearer that they were waiting for something. And as if thoughtful of the work before them, they no longer talked so fluently. Finally there was no talk at all, save the sporadic outbursts and the blue smoke, and the brown curled up in undisturbed drifts toward the ceiling until a bright halo formed around the gasoline lamp. A childish thought came to Bard, that where the smoke was so thick the fire could not be long delayed. A second form appeared in the doorway, lithe, graceful, and the light made her hair almost golden. "Evenin', fellers," called Sally jauntily. "Hello, Lawler. What you doing at the head of the table?" End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 30. The Lamp. The bluff was ended. It was as if the wind had blew a cloud suddenly from the face of the sun, and the yellow sunlight poured brightly over the world. So everyone in the room at the voice of Sally knew that the time had come for action. There was no vocal answer to her, but each man rose slowly in his place, his gun naked in his hand, and every face turned to Bard. "Gentlemen," he said in his soft voice, "I see that my friend Lawler has not wasted his lesson in manners. At least you know enough to rise when a lady enters the room." His gun, held at the hip, pointed straight down the table toward the burly form of Jansen, but his eyes, like those of a pugilist, seemed to be taking in every face at the table, and each man felt in some subtle manner that the danger would fall on him first. They did not answer, but hands were tightened around revolver butts. Lawler moved back, pace by pace, his revolver shaking in his hand. "But," went on Bard, "you are all facing me. Is it possible?" He laughed. "I knew that Mr. Drew was very anxious to receive me with courtesy, but I did not dream that he would be able to induce so many men to take care of me." And Sally Fortune, bracing herself against the wall with one hand, and in the capable grasp of the other a 6-gun balanced, stared in growing amazement on the scene, and shuddered at the silences. "Bard," she called, "what have I done?" "You've started a game," he answered, "which I presume we've all been waiting to play. What about it, boys? I hope you're well paid. I'd hate to die a cheap death." A voice, deep and ringing, sounded close at hand, almost within the room, and from a direction which Bard could not locate. "Don't harm him if you can help it, but keep him in that room." Bard stepped back a pace, till his shoulders touched the wall. "Sirs," he said, "if you keep me here, you will most certainly have to harm me." A figure ran around the edge of the crowd and stood beside him. "Stand clear of me, Sally," he muttered, much moved. "Stand away. This is a man's work." "The work of a pack of coyotes!" she cried shrilly. "What d'you mean?" She turned on them fiercely. "Are you going to murder a tenderfoot among you? One that ain't done no real harm? I don't believe my eyes. You there, Shorty Kilrain, I've waited on you with my own hands. You've played the man with me. Are you going to play the dog now? Jansen, you was telling me about a blue-eyed girl in Sweden. Have you forgotten about her now? And Calamity Ben, my God, ain't there a man among you to step over here and join the two of us?" They were shaken, but the memory of Drew quelled them. "They's no harm intended him, on my honor, Sally," said Lawlor. "All he's got to do is give up his gun and," he finished weakly, "let his hands be tied." "Is that all?" said Sally scornfully. "Don't follow me, Sally," said Bard. "Stay out of this. Boys, you may have been high paid, but I don't think you've been paid high enough to risk taking a chance with me. If you put me out with the first shot, that ends it, of course, but the chances are that I'll be alive when I hit the floor, and if I am, I'll have my gun working. And I won't miss. One or two of you are going to drop." He surveyed them with a quick glance which seemed to linger on each face. "I don't know who'll go first, but now I'm going to walk straight for that door, and I'm going out of it." He moved slowly, deliberately toward the door and around the table. Still they did not shoot. "Bard," commanded the voice which had spoken from nowhere before, "stop where you are. Are you fool enough to think I'll let you go? Are you William Drew?" "I am. And you are?" "The son of John Bard. Are you in this house?" "I am." "Listen to me for 30 seconds." "Not for 3. Sally, go out of this room and through that door." There was a grim command in his voice. It started her moving against her will. She paused and looked back with an imploring gesture. "Go on," he repeated. And she passed out of the door and stood there, a glimmering figure against the night. Still there was not a shot fired, though all those guns were trained on Bard. "You've got me, Drew," he called, "but I've got you and your hirelings, all of you, and I'm going to take you to hell with me. To hell!" He jerked his gun up and fired, not at a man, for the bullet struck the thin chain which held the gasoline lamp suspended, struck it with a clang, and it rushed down to the table. It struck, but not with the loud explosion which Bard had expected. There was a dull report, as of a shot fired at a great distance, the scream of Sally from the door, and then fire spurted from the lamp across the table, whipped in a flame to the ceiling, and licked against the walls. It shot to all sides, but it shot high, and every man was down on his face. Anthony, scarcely believing that he was still alive, rushed for the door, with a cry of agony ringing in his ears from the voice beyond the room. One man in all that crowd was near enough, or had the courage enough to obey the master even to the uttermost. The gaunt form of Calamity Ben blocked the doorway in front of Bard, blocked it with poised revolver. "Halt!" he yelled. But the other rushed on. Calamity whipped the gun down and fired, but even before the trigger was pulled he was sagging toward the floor, for Bard had shot to kill. Over the prostrate form of the cowpuncher he leapt, and into the night, where the white face of Sally greeted him. Outside the red inferno of that room, as if the taste of blood had maddened him, he raised his arms and shouted, like one crying a wild prayer: "William Drew! William Drew! Come out to me!" Small, strong hands gripped his wrist and turned him away from the house. "You fool!" cried Sally. "Ride for it! You've raised your hell at last. I knew you would." Red light flared in all the windows of the dining room. Shouts and groans and cursing poured out of them. Bard turned and followed her out toward the stable on the run, and he heard her moaning as she ran: "I knew it! I knew it!" She mounted her horse, which was tethered near the barn. He chose at random the first horse he reached, a gray, threw on his back the saddle which hung from the peg behind, mounted, and they were off through the night. No thought, no direction, but only in blind speed there seemed to be the hope of salvation. A mile, 2 miles dropped behind them, and then in an open stretch, for he had outridden her somewhat, Anthony reined back, caught the bridle of her horse, and pulled it down to a sharp trot. "Why have you come?" Their faces were so close that even through the night he could see the grim set of her lips. "Ain't you raised your hell, the hell you was hungry to raise? Don't you need help? What I've done is my own doing. I'll take the burden of it." "You'll take the halter for it, that's what you'll take. The whole range'll rise for this. You're already marked. Everywhere you've gone you've made an enemy. They'll be out to get you, Nash, Boardman, the whole gang." "Let it come. I'd do this all over again." "Born gunman, eh? Bard, you ain't got a week to live." It was fierceness. It was a reproach rather than sorrow. "Then let me go my own way. Why do you follow, Sally? Do you know these mountains?" "No, but—" "Then they'd run you down in 12 hours. Where'll you head for?" He said the first thought that entered his mind. "I'll go to the old house that Drew has on the other side of the range." "That ain't bad. Know the short cut?" "What cut?" "We can make it in 5 hours over one trail. But of course you don't know. Nobody but old Dan and me ever knowed it. Let go my bridle and ride like hell." She jerked the reins away from him and galloped off at full speed. He followed. "Sally!" he called. But she kept straight ahead, and he followed, shouting, imploring her to go back. Finally he settled to the chase, resolved on overtaking her. It was no easy task, for she rode like a centaur, and she knew the way. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 31. Nash Starts the Finish. Through the windows and the door the cowpunchers fled from the red spurt of the flames, each man for himself, except Shorty Kilrain, who stopped, gathered the lanky frame of Calamity Ben into his arms, and staggered out with his burden. The great form of William Drew loomed through the night. His hand on the shoulder of Shorty, he cried, "Is he badly burned?" "Shot," said Kilrain bitterly, "by the tenderfoot. Done for." It was strange to hear the big voice go shrill with pain. "Shot? By Anthony? Give him to me." Kilrain lowered his burden to the ground. "You've got him murdered. Ain't you through with him? Calamity, he was my pal." But the big man thrust him aside and knelt by the stricken cowpuncher. He commanded, "Gather the boys, form a line of buckets from the pump, fight that fire. It hasn't a hold on the house yet." The habit of obedience persisted in Kilrain. Under the glow of the fire, excited by the red light, the other men stood, irresolute, eager for action, but not knowing what to do. A picture came back to him of a ship laboring in a storm, the huddling men on the deck, the mate on the bridge, shrieking his orders through a megaphone. He cupped his hands at his mouth and began to bark orders. The men obeyed on the run. Some rushed for the kitchen and secured buckets. Two manned the big pump and started a great gush of water. In a moment a steady stream was being flung by the foremost men of the line against the smoking walls and even the ceiling of the dining room. So far it was the oil itself which had made most of the flame and smoke, and now, although the big table was on fire, the main structure of the house was hardly touched. They caught it in time and worked with a cheer, swinging the buckets from hand to hand, shouting as the flames fell little by little until the floor of the room was awash, the walls gave back clouds of steam, and the only fire was that which smoldered along the ruined table. Even this went out, hissing, at last, and they came back with blackened, singed faces to Calamity and Drew. The rancher had torn away the coat and shirt of the wounded man, and now, with much labor, was twisting a tight bandage around his chest. At every turn Calamity groaned feebly. Kilrain dropped beside his partner, taking the head between his hands. "Calamity, pal," he said. "How'd you let a damn tenderfoot do this?" The other sighed. "I dunno. I had him covered. I should have sent him to hell. But sure shootin' is better'n fast shootin'. He nailed me fair and square while I was blockin' him at the door. How d'you feel?" "Done for, Shorty. But damn glad that " His voice died away in a horrible whisper, and bubbles of red foam rose to his lips. "God!" groaned Shorty, and then called loudly, as if the strength of his voice might recall the other: "Calamity!" The eyes of Calamity rolled up. The wide lips twisted over formless words. There was no sound from his mouth. Someone was holding a lantern, whose light fell full on the silent struggle. It was Nash, his habitual sneer grown more malevolent than ever. "What of the feller who done it, Shorty?" he suggested. "So help me God," said the cattleman with surprising softness. "The range ain't big enough to keep him away from me." Drew, completing his bandage, said: "That's enough of such talk, Nash. Let it drop there. Here, Kilrain, take his feet. Help me into the house with him." They moved in, the rest trailing behind like sheep after a bellwether, and it was astonishing to see the care with which big Drew handled his burden, placing it at last on his own four-poster bed. "The old man's all busted up," said little Duffy to Nash. "I'd never have guessed he was so fond of Calamity." "You're a fool," answered Nash. "It ain't Calamity he cares about." "Then what the devil is it?" "I dunno. We're going to see some queer things around here." Drew, having disposed of the wounded man, carefully raising his head on a pillow, turned to the others. "Who saw Ben shot?" "I did," said Kilrain, who was making his way to the door. "Come back here. Are you sure you saw the shot fired?" "I seen the tenderfoot. Damn his eyes! Whip up his gun and take a snap shot while he was runnin' for the door where Calamity stood." Nash raised his lantern high, so that the light fell full on the face of Drew. The rancher was more gray than ever. He said, with almost an appeal in his voice: "Mightn't it have been one of the other boys, shooting at random?" The tone of Kilrain raised and grew ugly. "Are you tryin' to cover the tenderfoot, Drew?" The big man made a fierce gesture. "Why should I cover him?" "Because you been actin' damn queer," answered Nash. "Ah, you're here again, Nash. I know you hate Bard because he was too much for you." "He got the start of me, but I'll do a lot of finishing." "Kilrain," called Drew, "you're Calamity's best friend. Ride for Eldara and bring back Dr. Young. Quick. We're going to pull Ben through." "Just a waste of time," said Nash coolly. "He's got one foot in hell already." "You've said too much, Nash. Kilrain, are you going?" "I'll stop for the doctor at Eldara, but then I'll keep on riding." "What do you mean?" "Nothin'." "I'll go with you," said Nash, and turned with the other. "Stop!" called Drew. "Boys, I know what you have planned, but let the law take care of this. Remember, we were the aggressors against young Bard. He came peaceably into the house and I tried to hold him here. What would you have done in his place?" "They's a dozen men know how peaceable he is," said Nash dryly. "Wherever he's gone on the range he's raised hell. He's cut out for a killer, and Glendin in Eldara knows it. I'll talk to Glendin. In the meantime you fellas keep your hands off Bard. In the first place because if you take the law into your own hands you'll have me against you. Understand?" Kilrain and Nash glowered at him for a moment, and then backed through the door. As they hurried to the barn Kilrain asked: "What makes the chief act so soft to that hell raiser?" "If you have a feller cut out for your own meat," answered Nash, "do you want to have anyone else step in and take your meal away? But you and me, Steve, we'll get this bird. We'll get Glendin behind us first." "Why him?" "Play safe. Glendin can swear us in as deputies to apprehend, as he calls it, this Bard. Apprehendin' a feller like Bard simply means to shoot him down and ask him to come along afterwards, see? Nash, you got a great head. You ought to be one of these lawyers. There ain't nothin' you can't find a way out of. But will Glendin do it?" "He'll do what I ask him to do." "Friend of yours?" "Better'n a friend." "Got something on him?" "These here questions, they ain't polite, Shorty," grinned Nash. All right, you do the leadin' in this game. I'll just follow suit. But lay your course with nothin' but the topsails flyin', because I've got an idea we're goin' to hit a hell of a storm before we get back to port, Steve." "For my part," answered Nash, "I'm gettin' used to rough weather." They saddled their horses and cut across the hills straight for Eldara. Kilrain spurred viciously, and the roan had hard work keeping up. "Hold in," called Nash after a time. "Save your hoss, Shorty. This ain't no short trail. Did you notice the hosses when we was in the barn?" "Nope. Bard took Duffy's gray, and the gray can go like the devil. Hoss liftin'. That's another little mark on Bard's score." End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 32. To Apprehend a Man. As if to make up for its silence of the blast when the two reached it late the night before, Eldara was going full that evening. Kilrain went straight to Dr. Young, to bring him later to join Nash at the house of Deputy Glendon. The front of the deputy's house was utterly dark, but Nash, unabashed, knocked loudly on the door, and went immediately to the rear of the place. He was in time to see a light wink out at an upper window of the two-story shack. He slipped back, chuckling among the trees, and waited until the door slammed and a dark figure ran noiselessly down the steps and out into the night. Then he returned, still chuckling, to the front of the house and banged on the door again. A window above him raised at length, and a drawling voice, apparently overcome with sleep, called down, "What's up in Eldara?" Nash answered, "Everything's wrong. Deputy Glendon, he sits up in the back room playin' poker and hittin' red eye. No wonder Eldara's goin' to hell." A muffled cursing rolled down to the cowpuncher, and then a sharp challenge, "Who's there?" "Nash, you blockhead." "Nash!" cried a relieved voice. "Come in, confound you. I thought no matter what I thought. Come in." Nash opened the door and went up the stairs. The deputy met him, clad in a bathrobe and carrying a lamp. Under the bathrobe he was fully dressed. "Thought your game was called, eh?" grinned the cattleman. "Sure. I had a tidy little thing in blackjack runnin', and was pullin' the iron boys one after another. Why didn't you tip me off? You could have sat in with us." "Nope. I'm here on business." "Let's have it." He led the way back into the room and placed the lamp on a table littered with cards, and a black bottle looming in the center. "Drink?" "Nope. I said I came on business." "What kind?" "Bard." "I thought so. I want a posse." "What's he done?" "Killed Calamity Ben at Drew's place. Started a fire that near burned the house. And lifted Duffy's horse." Glendon whistled softly. "Nice little start." "Sure, and it's just beginnin' for this Bard. I'll go out to Drew's place and see what he's done." "And then start after him with a gang?" "Sure. By that time he'll be 1,000 miles away." "Well, I'm runnin' this little party. Let me get a gang together. You can swear 'em in and put me in charge. I'll guarantee to get him before morning." Glendon shook his head. "It ain't legal, Steve. You know that." "The hell with legality." "That's what you say, but I got to hold my job. You'll do your part goin' to Drew's place with Doc Young. He'll be here with Shorty Kilrain in a minute." "And let you go after Bard?" "Right. Far as I know, you may just shoot him down and then come back and say you done it because he resisted arrest." "Well?" "You admit that's what you want, Steve?" "Absolute." "Well, partner, it can't be done. That ain't apprehendin' a man. It's just plain murder." "Do you think you could ever catch that bird alive?" "I don't know. I'd try." "Never in 1,000 years. He don't know the country. He'll travel in a circle and I'll ride him down." "He's got somebody with him that knows the country better'n you and me." "Who?" The face of Nash twisted into an ugly grimace. Sally Fortune. The hell! It is, but it's true. It ain't possible. Sally ain't the kind to make a fool of herself about any man, let alone a gunfighter. That's what I thought, but I seen her back up this Bard against a room full of men. And she'll keep on backing him till he's got his toes turned up. That's another reason for you to get Bard, eh? Well, I can't send you after him, Nash. That's final. Not a bit. I know too much about you, Glendin. The glance of the other raised slowly, fixed on Nash, and then lowered to the floor. He produced papers and Durham, rolled and lighted his cigarette, and inhaled a long puff. So that's the game, Steve? I hate to do it. Let that go. You'll run the limit on this? Listen, Glendin, I've got to get this Bard. He's outridden me, outshot me, outgamed me, outlucked me, outguessed me, and taken Sally. He's mine. He belongs all to me. Do you see that? I'm only seeing one thing just now. I know. You think I'm double-crossing you. Maybe I am. But I'm desperate, Glendin. After all, mused the deputy, you'd simply be doing work I'd have to do later. You're right about this Bard. He'll never be taken alive. Good old Glendin. I knew you'd see the light. I'll go out and get the boys I want in 10 minutes. Wait here. Shorty and Doc Young will come in a minute. One more thing. When you get to Drew's place, you'll find him acting queer. What about? I don't know. It's a bad mess. You see, he's after this Bard himself. The way I figure it, he wants him left alone. He'd raise hell if he knew a posse was after the tenderfoot. Drew's a bad one to get against me. I know. You think I'm double-crossing? I'll do it. But this squares all scores between us, Steve. Right. It leaves the debt on my side. And you know I've never dodged an IOU. Drew may talk queer. He'll tell you that Bard done all that work in self-defense. Did he? The point is he killed a man and stole a hoss. No matter what comes of it, he's got to be arrested, don't he? And shot down while resisting arrest? Steve, I'd hate to have you out after me like this. But you won't listen to Drew? Not this one time. But Lord, man, I hate to face him if he's on the warpath. Who'll you take with you? Shorty, of course. He was Calamity Ben's pal. The rest will be, don't laugh, Butch Conklin and his gang. Butch? Hold yourself together. That's what I mean. Butch Conklin. After you dropped him the other night? Self-defense, and he knows it. I can find Butch, and I can make him go with me. Besides, he's out for Bard himself. The deputy said with much meaning, You can do a lot of queer things, Nash. Forget it, Glendin. I will for a while. Do you really think I can let you take out Butch and his gunmen agin Bard? Why, they're 10 times worse than the tenderfoot. Maybe, but there's nothing proved agin 'em. Nothing but a bit of cattle liftin', maybe, and things like that. The point is, they're all hard men, and with 'em along I can't help but get Bard. Murder ain't proved on Butch and his men, but it will be before long. Wait till it's proved. In the meantime, use 'em all. You've a long head, Nash. Glendin, I'm making the biggest play of my life. I'm off to find Butch. You'll stand firm with Drew? I won't hear a word he says. So long. Be back in 10 minutes. Wait for me. He was as good as his word. Even before the 10 minutes had elapsed he was back, and behind him followed a crew of heavy thumping boots up the stairs of Glendin's house and into the room where he sat with Dr. Young and Shorty Kilrain. They rose, but not from respect, when Nash entered with Conklin and his 4 ill-famed followers behind. The soiled bandage on the head of Butch was far too thick to allow his hat to sit in its normal position. It was perched high on top and secured in place by a bit of string which passed from side to side under the chin. Behind him came Lovell, an almost albino type with straw-colored hair and eyes bleached and passionless. The vacuous smile was never gone from his lips. More feared and more hated than Conklin himself was Isaacs. The latter was fastidious, wore a blue striped vest, without a coat to obscure it, and about his throat was knotted a flaming vermilion necktie, fastened in place with a diamond stick pin, obviously the spoil of some recent robbery. Glendin, watching, ground his teeth. McNamara followed. He had been a squatter, but his family had died of a fever, and McNamara's mind had been unsettled ever since. Whiskey had finished the work of sending him on the downward path with Conklin's little crew of desperadoes. Men shrank from facing those two bright, wandering eyes, yet it was from pity almost as much as horror. Finally came Ufert. He was merely a round-faced boy of 19, proud of the distinguished bad company he kept. He was that weak-minded type which is only strong when it becomes wholly evil. With different leadership he would have become simply a tobacco-chewing hanger-on at crossroads saloons and general merchandise stores. As it was, feeling dignified by the brotherhood of crime into which he had been admitted as a full member, and eager to prove his qualifications, he was as dangerous as any member of the crew. The three men who were already in the room had been prepared by Glendin for this new arrival, but the fact was almost too much for their credence. Consequently they rose, and Dr. Young muttered at the ear of Glendin: "Is it possible, Deputy Glendin, that you're going to use these fellows?" "A thief to catch a thief," whispered Glendin in reply. He said aloud: "Butch, I've been looking for you for a long time, but I never really expected to see you quite as close as this." "You said it," grinned Butch. "I ain't been watching for you real close, but now that I see you, you look more or less like a man should look. How are you, Glendin?" He held out his hand, but the deputy, shifting his position, seemed to overlook the grimy proffered palm. "You fellows know that you're wanted by the law," he said, frowning on them. A grim meaning rose in the vacuous eyes of Lovell. Isaacs caressed his diamond pen, smiling in a sickly fashion. McNamara's wandering stare fixed and grew unhumanly bright. Ufert openly dropped his hand on his gun butt and stood sullenly defiant. "You know that you're wanted, and you know why," went on Glendin. "But I've decided to give you a chance to prove you're white men and useful citizens. Nash has already told you what we want. It's work for 7 men against 1, but that 1 is apt to give you all plenty to do. If you are successful," he stammered a little over the right word, "what you have done in the past will be forgotten. Hold your right hands up and repeat after me." And they repeated the oath after him in a broken, drawling chorus, stumbling over the formal, legal phraseology. He ended, and then: "Nash, you're in charge of the gang. Do what you want to with them, and remember that you're to get Bard back in town unharmed, if possible." Butch Conklin smiled, and the smile spread grimly from face to face among the gang. Evidently this point had already been elucidated to them by Nash, who now mustered them out of the house and assembled them on their horses in the street below. "Which way do we travel?" asked Shorty Kilrain, reining close beside the leader, as though he were anxious to disestablish any relationship with the rest of the party. "2 ways," answered Nash. "Of course I don't know what way Bard headed, because he's got the girl with him, but I figure it this way: if a tenderfoot knows any part of the range at all, he'll go in that direction after he's in trouble. I've seen it work out before. So I think Bard may have ridden straight for the old Drew place on the other side of the range. I know a shortcut over the hills. We can reach there by morning. Kilrain, you'll go there with me. It may be that Bard will go near the place, but not right to it. Chances may be good that he'll put up at some place near the old ranch house, but not right on the spot. Jerry Wood, he's got a house about 4 or 5 miles to the north of Drew's old ranch. Butch, you take your men and ride to Wood's place. Then switch south and ride for Partridge's store. If we miss him at Drew's old house, we'll go on and you join us at Partridge's store, and then we'll double back. He'll be somewhere inside that circle and Eldara. You can lay on that. Now, boys, are your hosses fresh?" They were. "Then ride, and don't spare the spurs. Hoss flesh is cheaper than your own hides." The cavalcade separated and galloped in 2 directions through the town of Eldara. End of chapter 32.